The low hum of the airplane filled the cabin, a constant vibration that almost felt like it was humming through your bones. Overhead, the fluorescent lights flickered softly, washing the rows of passengers in pale yellow light. A toddler cried somewhere near the back, her wails muffled by a flight attendant's soft voice. The smell of reheated food drifted through the air, mixing with the faint scent of jet fuel that clung to everyone's clothes. Seat 12F sat by the window, tucked into the far edge of the row. There, a man leaned his head against the cool glass, watching clouds drift lazily by. He was a single dad. No ring on his finger, no smile on his face, just a quiet man with a tired posture, his hands calloused from years of hard work. His jacket was worn at the elbows, his boots scuffed from too many miles. No one noticed him. The businessman in the aisle seat was too busy typing furiously on his laptop, glancing at him only once with mild irritation when the man adjusted his seat. The woman in the middle seat was scrolling through her phone, earbuds in, pretending not to exist. Flight attendants passed him by without a second glance, their attention fixed on first-class passengers asking for champagne refills. He didn't mind. He was used to being invisible. He shifted slightly, pulling his old duffel bag closer to his feet. It was a kind of bag that had been everywhere, desert sands, icy mountains, crowded airports, and yet it carried no brand logo. Just scratches, dirt stains, and a single faded patch sewn near the strap. He rested one hand on it, almost protectively. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. The clouds glowed softly, like they were on fire. He stared at them with a faraway expression, his lips moving slightly as if he was counting or remembering. A jolt shook the plane. The seatbelt sign chimed, and passengers murmured nervously. Drinks wobbled on tray tables, and a few people grabbed their armrests. The flight attendants' smiles were polite but tight, the kind of smiles that didn't reach their eyes. "Just some turbulence, folks," the captain's voice said calmly through the speakers. But the man in 12F didn't even flinch. He sat straighter, eyes narrowing as if he could see something no one else could. He adjusted his seatbelt, his fingers quick and precise, then glanced out the window again. The businessman next to him gave a nervous laugh. "Not a fan of flying?" he asked, trying to make small talk. The man didn't answer immediately. He looked at him for a moment, his eyes sharp, alert. "Always respect the sky," he said quietly. His voice was deep, steady. The businessman chuckled awkwardly, unsure what to say, and went back to his laptop. The woman in the middle seat pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, avoiding eye contact. The man's gaze flicked upward. A soft, rhythmic tapping had started somewhere above, maybe a loose latch in the overhead bin, maybe something else. His eyes moved with precision, scanning the cabin. He noted exits, counted heads, memorized faces. It was automatic, like breathing. He reached down and touched his duffel bag again. Inside, beneath layers of folded clothes, something heavy rested. Something he hadn't needed in years, but always kept close. Another bump rocked the plane, harder this time. Gasps filled the cabin. Someone's drink spilled, splashing across the aisle. A flight attendant hurried past, her smile faltering for a split second. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice returned, still calm but with a strange edge to it. "We're adjusting our course slightly due to some unexpected weather." Weather. The man's jaw tightened. He pressed his forehead against the window, scanning the horizon. Far below, the ocean glittered like shards of glass. And then he saw it, just a flicker at first. A shadow slicing across the clouds. A shape that moved too fast, too precise to be another passenger jet. He exhaled slowly, a sound only he could hear. The businessman was still typing. The woman had her eyes closed, trying to sleep. Around him, passengers whispered nervously, but no one else noticed. No one ever noticed. The man closed his eyes briefly, breathing in through his nose. A faint scent of metal and engine oil reached him, a smell no one else would have recognized. His fingers tapped on his knee, an unconscious rhythm, a code only a handful of people in the world would understand. His heartbeat slowed, his breathing evened out. Years of training kicked in. He wasn't just a man in 12F. Another flicker. This time, he caught a clearer glimpse, a glint of sunlight off polished steel. A jet. And not just any jet. He reached for the shade and pulled it down halfway, masking his view from curious eyes. But he kept looking, tilting his head just enough to see the movement outside. Something was happening. Something none of these passengers would ever understand. And he knew exactly what to do. A voice crackled faintly through the cabin speakers again, but this time he didn't hear the captain's words. His mind was elsewhere, calculating distances, estimating flight paths. He flexed his fingers, feeling the tension in his muscles ease into a kind of sharp focus. He'd been here before, not in this exact seat, not on this exact plane, but in this exact kind of moment. Moments before the world noticed. The businessman finally looked up from his laptop, sensing something strange. "You all right, man?" he asked, forcing a smile. The man turned his head slowly, meeting his eyes. "Fine," he said, voice calm. Too calm. The businessman shifted uncomfortably and went back to typing. The man in 12F leaned forward, hands clasped loosely, eyes flicking between the window and the aisle. He was silent, but inside, his mind was racing. Outside, another shadow streaked across the clouds. The man's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. They had found him. And soon, the entire plane would know exactly who they were flying with. No one paid attention to him. Not the passengers. Not the flight attendants. Not even the captain. But within minutes, fighter jets would change their course because of him. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the hum of the engines deepened. It wasn't unusual, but the shift was enough to make a few passengers glance up nervously. The man in 12F didn't look nervous at all. If anything, his posture changed, subtle, almost unnoticeable. He sat straighter, his eyes sharp, scanning the cabin as if every detail mattered. Outside, the sky was streaked with orange and pink, fading into deep indigo at the horizon. The plane cut through a stretch of thin clouds, the wings trembling gently in the wind. From this height, the world below looked serene, almost fragile. But he knew better. The air could be calm one second and turn hostile the next. Another jolt rocked the plane. This time, gasps spread like ripples. The businessman beside him clutched his laptop and muttered, "What the hell?" while the woman in the middle seat grabbed the armrest with white-knuckled fingers. The man in 12F didn't flinch. His gaze was fixed out the window, searching. A faint buzz crackled over the intercom. The captain's voice returned, still calm, but now slower, more deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." There was something in his tone, something measured. The man's jaw tightened. He'd heard that tone before, not from commercial pilots, but from soldiers in the field. It was the voice of someone trying to stay calm for everyone else's sake. Passengers began whispering. Someone rang for a flight attendant. A baby cried again, louder this time, her wails echoing through the narrow cabin. The businessman sighed, annoyed. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, glancing at the man in 12F. "They should have warned us if this was going to be a rough flight." The man turned his head slowly, his calm gaze locking onto him. "Stay seated," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight the businessman couldn't quite place. It wasn't a suggestion. The businessman blinked, swallowed hard, and leaned back in his seat. A sudden pop from overhead made several passengers flinch. A drink cart rattled in the aisle as a flight attendant grabbed it to steady herself. Her fake smile faltered just for a second before she quickly plastered it back on. "Just a little bump, folks," she said, her voice too high, too rehearsed. But the man in 12F had already noticed something she hadn't. The faint, rhythmic flash of light far beyond the wing. He tilted his head slightly, catching another glint of sunlight bouncing off something metallic, something moving too fast to be commercial. He inhaled slowly, his hand tightening on the armrest. In the cockpit, a coded radio transmission buzzed faintly through the speakers. Passengers couldn't hear it, but the man in 12F could almost feel it, like a vibration in the air. His instincts were sharper than most people's fears. He didn't need to hear the exact words to know that something wasn't right. Unidentified aircraft. Maintain current altitude. Do not deviate from course. He'd heard this before. Too many times. The plane jolted harder this time, causing a few overhead bins to pop open. A purse tumbled out, scattering makeup onto the aisle. Gasps turned into small cries as passengers clutched their seats, some praying under their breath. The man in 12F stayed perfectly still, his eyes on the horizon. He saw them now. Not one, but two. 2F. 22 Raptors, sleek and silver against the fading sunlight, moving like predators, circling their prey. They weren't close enough to be threatening yet, but they were close enough for him to know this wasn't a coincidence. They weren't circling the plane. They were circling him. His hand moved to his duffel bag, sliding it slightly closer to his feet. The businessman noticed and frowned. "What's in there, man?" he whispered, his voice shaky. The man didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, looking past the businessman to the aisle. He noted the position of the flight attendants, the nearest exit, the layout of the cabin. Everything. Every detail was logged, processed, filed away in an instant. The woman in the middle seat was trembling now, her phone clutched tight in her hands. "Is everything okay?" she whispered to no one in particular. The man turned his head toward her, his expression calm, almost gentle. "Stay calm," he said softly. "You're safe." There was something about his tone, firm but soothing, that made her believe him, even though she had no reason to. Outside, the F-22s moved closer, their sleek forms cutting through the sky like blades. The sunlight glinted off their canopies, flashing into the cabin for a split second. The man in 12F narrowed his eyes. He recognized the formation. He recognized the way they moved, like a silent dance in the air. They weren't just flying by. They were waiting. For him. Another announcement came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been instructed to adjust our altitude. Please remain seated. Cabin crew, please take your seats." This time, there was no mistaking it. That calm voice was a mask, and the man in 12F could hear the edge of tension beneath it. The businessman beside him looked pale. "Why are there fighter jets out there?" he whispered. The man didn't answer. He simply looked back out the window, his jaw tightening. He reached into his duffel bag, sliding his hand inside, but kept the movement slow, discreet. His fingers brushed against cool metal, worn smooth over years of use. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. Not yet. He was reaching for something far more powerful. Something they would understand. The plane banked slightly, dipping its wing. Passengers gasped as drinks spilled and bags shifted overhead. The baby screamed louder. A man in the aisle shouted, "What's going on?" Chaos buzzed through the cabin like static electricity, but the man in 12F remained calm. His fingers closed around the object in his bag. He exhaled slowly, counting in his head. 3 seconds. 2. 1. It was time. He glanced at the businessman beside him, who was staring at him wide-eyed. "Stay calm," he repeated, his voice low and steady. Then he turned his gaze out the window and leaned closer to the glass. His hand lifted slowly, deliberately, and he gave the first signal. The entire cabin was filled with whispers and fear. But outside, the jets shifted. They had seen his signal, and now they were waiting for his next move. The cabin buzzed with nervous whispers. A few passengers tried to peek out the windows, curious about the sudden dips and turns of the aircraft, but no one saw what the man in 12F was seeing. His eyes were locked on the sky, outside, on the two sleek fighter jets shadowing their plane like silent predators. The hum of the engines was steady, but something about the way the aircraft moved felt deliberate, controlled. The captain's calm voice over the intercom wasn't calming him. It was confirming what he already suspected. This wasn't turbulence. This was a warning. The man's hand rested casually on the window ledge, but his fingers moved in a rhythm that was anything but casual. 3 taps. A pause. 2 taps. A pause. 1 slow tap. A code. Outside, the nearest jet seemed to bank ever so slightly, the sunlight glinting off its canopy like a flash of acknowledgement. The businessman beside him shifted nervously, trying to act like he wasn't watching, but his eyes betrayed him. What are you doing?" he whispered. The man didn't look at him. "They're not here for the plane," he said calmly. His voice so low it was almost a whisper. The businessman froze. "What do you mean not for the plane?" The man finally turned his head, his gaze steady and unreadable. "They're here for me." The businessman's mouth fell open, but before he could speak, the plane lurched again, sending a ripple of fear through the cabin. A woman screamed. The baby's cries grew frantic. The man in 12F stayed calm, his hand resting now against the cool glass. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his palm flat on the window, fingers spread. From a distance, to anyone watching from the outside, that hand placement would mean one thing: identification. The woman in the middle seat clutched her phone like a lifeline. "Why are there fighter jets out there? Are we in danger?" she whispered, her voice shaking. The man turned his head slightly, his calm gaze meeting hers. "Not if I can help it," he said softly. His words carried weight, though she couldn't understand why. Her breathing slowed, as if his voice alone reassured her. The fighter jet closest to their wing shifted position, gliding closer until it was almost parallel. Through the thick glass of the cockpit, a pilot's face was just visible beneath the helmet visor. The man in 12F stared back, his expression unreadable but commanding. He lifted his hand slightly and traced a single, sharp motion against the window. The pilot tilted his head, then raised 2 fingers to his helmet in acknowledgement. Inside the cabin, chaos was brewing. A man stood up from his seat, arguing with a flight attendant. "I need to know what's going on. We're being followed by military planes." "Sir, please sit down," the flight attendant pleaded, panic creeping into her voice. The man in 12F spoke suddenly, his voice deep and commanding, cutting through the noise. "Sit down." The passenger froze, startled by the tone, and slowly sank back into his seat. The flight attendant glanced at the man in 12F, wide-eyed, as if sensing something different about him. She didn't speak, but she gave him a small nod before hurrying down the aisle. The businessman leaned closer, his voice trembling. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he reached back into his duffel bag and pulled out a small, metallic object. It wasn't a weapon. It was a simple, weathered device, a signal beacon no bigger than his palm. It looked old, scratched, and unremarkable, but the moment it clicked on, a faint red light blinked in rhythm. Click. Pause. Click. Click. Pause. Click. The man set it against the window, perfectly angled for the jets to see. Outside, both F-22s shifted again, their sleek frames cutting through the fading sunlight like knives. This time, their movement wasn't random. It was synchronized, precise, respectful. The businessman's jaw dropped. They're saluting you." The man in 12F remained silent, but his expression softened just slightly. A shadow of memory crossed his face, faces of men he'd trained, missions flown in the dead of night, the weight of rank and responsibility. He'd left that world behind. Or so he thought. A soft chime rang in the cabin as the captain's voice came through again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared to continue on course. Please remain seated." But even through the calm announcement, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The tension in the air hadn't lifted. It had deepened. The fighter jets weren't leaving. They were escorting. Passengers began to notice. Heads turned to the windows. Whispers filled the cabin. A boy in the row ahead pressed his face against the glass, wide-eyed. "Mom, there's a fighter jet right there," he exclaimed, pointing. His mother shushed him quickly, her face pale. The businessman glanced at the man in 12F again, his voice shaking. You're someone important, aren't you?" "Military." The man finally spoke, his tone calm but edged with authority. "I was." The businessman swallowed hard. "Then why are they here?" The man didn't answer right away. He simply watched the jets outside, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "They've been waiting for me." The beacon blinked steadily in his hand, its rhythm like a heartbeat. The jets adjusted their positions, one pulling slightly ahead, the other hanging back, a protective formation. Passengers were staring now, murmuring, confusion spreading like wildfire. The tension in the cabin was palpable, a mix of fear and awe. The man in 12F closed his eyes for a brief moment, centering himself. He could feel every beat of his heart, every vibration of the aircraft. He'd been in situations like this before, high stakes, no room for mistakes. And he knew exactly what would happen next. He opened his eyes and looked out at the lead jet. The pilot inside raised a gloved hand to his helmet, holding it there in a salute. The man in 12F raised his hand in return, palm against the glass. The gesture was simple, but the message was unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the cabin as the fighter jets adjusted their formation, their wings glinting in the sunlight. The businessman sat frozen, his laptop forgotten. The woman beside him stared in awe. The man's voice was quiet but firm as he spoke, almost like a command. Stay calm. They are here to protect us now. In the skies above, two of the world's most advanced fighter jets were no longer circling like predators. They were guarding him. And for the first time, the passengers realized the quiet man in 12F wasn't just another traveler. The cabin was silent now. Not a hush of calm, but a tense, breath-holding silence that felt like the world itself had paused. Even the crying baby in the back of the plane had quieted, soothed by her mother's soft whispers. Passengers who had been restless minutes ago now sat frozen, eyes glued to the windows where 2F-22 Raptors glided like shadows of steel angels. And all of them were watching the man in 12F. The businessman beside him was pale, his hands trembling as they gripped the laptop that now sat forgotten on his lap. The woman in the middle seat hadn't blinked in what felt like minutes, her phone clutched so tightly it looked like it might crack. A few rows ahead, a little boy whispered loudly to his father, his voice filled with awe. "Dad!" They saluted him. The jets saluted him. The father didn't respond. He just stared at the man in 12F with wide, confused eyes. The man sat perfectly still, his hand resting flat against the window, the beacon blinking steadily in rhythm. Outside, the lead jet hovered closer, its canopy catching the fading sunlight. Through the glare, the silhouette of the pilot was visible, head bowed slightly, hand raised in a crisp salute. This wasn't standard procedure. This wasn't protocol. This was respect. The man in 12F's face didn't change. But behind his calm eyes, memories stirred. Memories of nights spent in foreign skies, missions so classified they didn't have names, and comrades who'd never made it home. His hand pressed harder against the glass, as if the weight of everything he carried could pass through that single gesture. The businessman finally found his voice, though it cracked when he spoke. Who are you?" The man turned his head slowly, his gaze locking on him. His voice was steady, low, and almost tired. "Someone who's done things no one should ever have to do." The businessman swallowed hard and looked away, shame and awe flashing across his face. Around them, passengers began whispering quietly, their curiosity too strong to contain. "He must be a general. Is he Secret Service? No, look at those jets, they're military escorts. This guy's someone big." The man in 12F closed his eyes briefly, shutting out their voices. He didn't feel big. He didn't feel powerful. In truth, he had boarded this flight hoping for anonymity, for just a few hours of peace at 35,000 feet. But the past has a way of finding you, even in the clouds. The jets shifted formation again, one sliding slightly lower, the other pulling back. The movement was smooth, precise, like a silent ballet in the sky. The sun dipped lower, painting the Raptors in a golden glow, their sleek bodies reflecting streaks of orange and red. For a moment, it didn't feel like danger. It felt like a ceremony. A flight attendant approached slowly, her steps tentative, her expression caught between fear and respect. She stopped a few feet away and lowered her voice. "Sir, the captain would like to know if there's anything you need." The man opened his eyes and looked up at her. Her hands were trembling slightly, but she stood tall, trying to maintain professionalism. "Tell him thank you," the man said softly, "and to stay on course. Everything's under control." The attendant hesitated, as if she wanted to ask more, but she nodded and hurried back to the cockpit. The businessman leaned closer, whispering urgently, "Why are they escorting us? Are we in danger? Is this about you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a small, worn patch from his jacket pocket, a military insignia, frayed around the edges, but still sharp in design. He turned it over in his fingers for a moment, his thumb brushing over the stars and stripes stitched into the fabric. The businessman's breath caught. "You're military." The man's eyes flicked to him, and for the first time, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. He corrected. "A long time ago." He placed the patch gently on his tray table, then turned his attention back to the sky. The lead jet adjusted its altitude slightly, its nose dipping before rising again. The gesture was subtle but deliberate. A second salute. This time, the man in 12F responded not with his hand, but with a slight nod, his face solemn. Inside the cabin, the weight of the moment was palpable. Even passengers who didn't understand military customs felt it, the reverence, the quiet acknowledgement of someone extraordinary among them. The boy in the row ahead whispered again, his voice filled with wonder. "Mom, is he a hero?" His mother hushed him gently, glancing back at the man in 12F with wide, searching eyes. She didn't have an answer, but deep down she knew. The man in 12F rested his hand back on his duffel bag, his expression unreadable. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a ghost, someone carrying too many stories that no one would ever hear. The salutes weren't for him as a person. They were for what he represented. Sacrifice, duty, a lifetime of service, and maybe respect for the fact that even legends grow old. The jets held their escort formation, their presence a silent shield. The tension in the cabin had shifted. Fear had been replaced with awe, uncertainty with quiet reverence. People weren't just staring anymore. They were watching him with the kind of respect usually reserved for monuments and memorials. The businessman finally spoke again, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You saved lives, didn't you?" The man didn't look at him. He simply said, "Not enough." Silence fell again, heavier this time. Outside, the jets gleamed against the last light of sunset, their wings cutting across the sky like blades of honor. The woman in the middle seat finally whispered, tears in her eyes, "Thank you for whatever you've done." The man glanced at her, and for a moment, his stoic expression softened. He gave a small nod, then turned back to the window. The captain's voice came over the speakers once more, this time with a hint of awe. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We have been given clearance to proceed, and you may notice a military escort accompanying us for the remainder of the flight. Everything is fine. Thank you for your cooperation." Passengers exchanged glances, but no one spoke. Everyone knew something extraordinary was happening, even if they didn't understand why. The man in 12F leaned back in his seat, his hand still resting on the window. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, older, weathered, but steady. Outside, the raptors flew like loyal sentinels, keeping watch. And in that moment, the quiet man no one had noticed became the reason they all felt safe. The world would never know his name. Not the passengers, not even the captain. But somewhere above the clouds, two pilots had just saluted him like a living legend. The cabin felt different now. The tension from before had been replaced by something heavier, deeper. Respect hung in the air like mist, thick and unspoken. No one dared raise their voice. No one demanded explanations anymore. Even the most impatient passengers, the ones who'd been loudly complaining about flight delays and turbulence earlier, now sat in quiet reflection, stealing glances at the man in seat 12F. Outside, the sky was a masterpiece of twilight. Deep purple clouds stretched across a horizon lined with orange and gold. The two F-22 Raptors held their position perfectly, their wings glinting in the fading light, their presence an unshakable reminder. This was no ordinary flight, and that quiet man by the window was no ordinary traveler. The little boy in the row ahead turned again, peeking through the gap in the seats. "Mom," he whispered, his voice soft but curious. "Is he a general?" His mother didn't answer right away. She simply looked back at the man in 12F, her eyes wide with awe. Finally, she leaned down and whispered to her son, "I think he's someone very important. Someone we should be grateful for." The boy's eyes widened, and he smiled shyly at the man. The man noticed and gave him a small nod, a rare flicker of warmth breaking through his calm expression. The businessman beside him cleared his throat, finally finding the courage to speak. "Look, I'm sorry," he said awkwardly, his voice shaky. I judged you earlier. Thought you were just some guy. I didn't know." The man in 12F didn't look at him, just kept his eyes on the jets outside. "Most people don't," he replied quietly. The businessman swallowed hard, guilt flashing across his face. "Still, thank you. For whatever you've done. For keeping us safe. For everything." The man finally turned his head, his calm gaze landing on him. There was no pride, no smugness in his eyes. Only a quiet heaviness, the kind that comes from carrying too much for too long. He nodded once, a simple acknowledgement. "Safe is all that matters," he said softly. The woman in the middle seat had tears in her eyes. She didn't speak, but her trembling hands gripped the edge of her blanket. The man noticed, and for a brief moment his expression softened. He leaned slightly toward her. "You're okay," he said gently. Her eyes met his, and she nodded, wiping at her tears. She didn't know why she felt so emotional, but something about this moment, the salute, the jets, this quiet stranger, had stirred something deep inside her. A flight attendant approached again, her voice hushed, her eyes full of something like reverence. "Sir," she whispered, "the captain asked if you'd like to see the cockpit when we land. He said it would be an honor." The man gave a faint smile, shaking his head. "No need," he said. "Tell him thank you. And good flying." The attendant blinked, then smiled softly, nodding before walking away. The minutes passed slowly as the plane cut through the evening sky. The jets outside remained perfectly synchronized, one slightly above, one just below, a silent escort of steel and honor. Passengers pressed their faces to the windows, whispering in awe, snapping photos they'd never truly understand the meaning of. To them, this was a rare, extraordinary sight. To him, it was a farewell gesture, a recognition of what had been. He leaned back in his seat, exhaling softly. For the first time during the entire flight, his body relaxed. His hand slid from the duffel bag, and he let it rest in his lap. The steady blinking of the beacon reflected faintly on the window, like a pulse. The businessman glanced at him, curiosity still gnawing at him. "You must have been high-ranking," he said cautiously. "I mean, they don't do that for just anyone." The man in 12F gave a small, humorless smile. "Rank doesn't matter anymore. Not up here. Not today." The businessman hesitated. Then why the escort? The salute? The man's eyes stayed fixed on the jets. His voice was quiet, but firm. "They're honoring the uniform. Not me. The ones who didn't make it home." The businessman's breath caught. He looked away, shame flooding his face. He thought of all the times he'd ignored quiet men like this in airports, all the times he'd assumed things about strangers based on their clothes or their silence. Now he understood. The announcement crackled through the speakers again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. We'll be landing shortly." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabin. People shifted in their seats, but their voices remained soft, subdued. This wasn't like a normal flight where people chatted loudly, eager to get off the plane. This was different. The respect in the air was tangible. The man in 12F glanced out the window one last time as the jets peeled away, their wings flashing in the last light of the setting sun. The lead jet dipped its nose slightly before breaking formation, a final salute. The man's hand rested against the glass as he gave them a slow nod. And then they were gone. When the plane landed and taxied toward the gate, no one rushed to grab their bags. No one stood too quickly or pushed past each other. They all glanced at him, their quiet guardian in seat 12F, with expressions of gratitude, curiosity, and awe. The flight attendants gave him small, respectful smiles as they passed. One of them mouthed the words, "Thank you," before continuing down the aisle. He gathered his duffel bag and stood, moving with quiet confidence. The businessman beside him quickly stepped aside. "You go first," he said softly. The man nodded, but said nothing. He walked calmly down the aisle, every eye on him, yet no one dared speak. As he stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the world returned to its usual chaos. People rushing for connecting flights, announcements blaring overhead, the smell of coffee and jet fuel mixing in the air. But for the passengers of Flight 227, something had changed. They'd seen a glimpse of history. They'd met a man they'd never forget. And yet, to him, he was just a tired single dad with a worn-out duffel bag, heading home. That night, as social media buzzed with blurry photos of fighter jets escorting a commercial plane, none of the passengers revealed his name. No one asked. Some heroes don't need recognition, and some legends prefer to stay in seat 12F. Would you have noticed him? That quiet man by the window, dressed like any other traveler. Would you have seen the weight he carried, the stories behind his calm eyes? Share your thoughts below, and tell us, have you ever met someone who turned out to be far more extraordinary than they appeared?